True. Um, Tell me, in what ways can spec- specifically with the civil side of everything, how could that be affecting an individual or a family going either through a custody battle or something like that? Is there kind of some examples that you've had historically, either from your career or from people that you know, where you can see how those courts really make an impact there?
Certainly, I truly believe, having practiced so much family law, that pound for pound, family law cases and the results or the outcomes of family law cases have much more actual impact on people's lives than anything else, more broadly than anything else a district court does. Criminal cases are very important, and you want to think of those as having the most effect. And certainly, if you're someone who gets sentenced to a long term in prison, it has a huge effect on your life. But that's mostly pointing at you. A lot of the things that other people are affected by, such as victims and things of that nature, has already happened. And so the court decision may, sort of play on those a little bit, but it doesn't change any of those things. In a family law case, you're going to have several players. You're going to usually have parents, especially when kids are involved. You're going to have kids, and all of those people are going to be affected by the decision that the court makes. And these days, they're making more and more of these decisions. There's more and more, not so much the caseload itself hasn't increased, but the contentiousness and the amount of court time as far as people arguing over things has increased. And so judges are making more and more decisions on family law cases that will directly impact how those people interact as a family for there on out. As an example, it's a very extreme example, but a case that many years ago we had where a couple had wanted to adopt a child, and they became acquainted with this girl that was pregnant, and they reached an agreement they were going to adopt her child, and she had the child, and the child came with the couple, and the mother had some reservations, but continued to let the adoption go forward. And some of the paperwork was done, and there was part of it got done, and we got several months into it, and the mother decided she did not want to relinquish the child. Of course, the prospective adoptive parents had already bonded with the child, did not want to give up at that point. And so we get into litigation, which, it takes us several months, more, to get into court. And we have a jury trial. And the jury trial was over the termination of the parents' rights. And where it became a very difficult situation is that it was very hard to prove that the mother had done anything wrong so that her rights should be terminated, other than she had decided to give this child up for adoption and changed her mind. But on the flip side of it, it was pretty clear that the child was in a really good position and a really good family, and why would we take that child out of there? And so when it got down to time for the judge to give the jury instructions, we were advocating for the adoptive parents, but we told the judge, we said, Judge, we're not real sure what the jury's going to do on whether they will terminate this parent, but we do believe the evidence is very strong that they're going to want to leave the child with the adoptive parents, at least in custody, as legal custody. But the judge refused to instruct the jury on that alternative possibility. Well, the jury was only given one possibility: either return the child to the mother or terminate her rights. So they terminated her rights. It went up on appeal, and a year or two later, an appellate court said there was not enough evidence to terminate her rights. And since the court had not allowed the jury to consider another alternative, then there was nothing for the appellate court to send it back to. So the appellate court simply ordered that the child go back to the mother, who, she really had no relationship with. That's a very extreme example how everybody's world was in turmoil for a period of time. The mother's world finally was righted. The adoptive parents' world was shattered, and I can say, from personal knowledge, they were never the same. It ruined their marriage. And I can happily say, even though it was what I was not advocating for at the time, The little girl has went on to be very successful and is, I believe, a physician now.
Wow.
And so there's no there. Maybe there's winners eventually, but no one wins when this happens. And so really getting everything right, every step you go along is very important, because it is going to affect people for a long, long time in the family law situation.
Yeah, very, very interesting there. Because yeah, you can have just such a major impact on that family, and during that time, especially, and making a decision for a child, it's a far-reaching impact for sure. I also wanted to ask you just kind of about the criminal side of your practice in the past. As a person who is representing people who are accused of different crimes, I feel like one of your jobs is to ensure the due process for those people and that you are representing. And can you kind of give me an example of a time where you were able to ensure the rights of one of your clients were not infringed upon or exploited by the state?
Yes, I can. The most I guess notorious example would be the case of a young man named Levi King, who back in I believe it was 2005 or 6, committed a double homicide in Missouri, and then got in his car and drove over and randomly stopped in the Texas Panhandle in the middle of the night, committed a home invasion, and killed 3 of 4 members of a family in that home. And I was part of a defense team that represented him on the capital murder charges in Texas, where the state sought the death penalty. It was an especially egregious event. Mr. King didn't really have a stellar background. Some of that was mitigated by how bad his background was as far as his family background and how he'd been treated, but he certainly didn't have a lot going for him in that trial. And certainly, as in any capital case, it's the top example of a criminal case of your first and foremost defending the system. And the system is due process. The system is making sure that the state is held to every requirement that is in existence for protecting people's rights. And that is really your sole job. And the thought is that if you do that job, then you will, number one, you will have protected the system, you will have protected the integrity of the system, you will have given that person a fair trial. Number two, that if there's any question about the person's guilt, that would be resolved in their favor because you have protected those rights. And in that case, we were really fortunate. The trial judge, unlike any other capital case I'd been into that day, was really generous with resources. Normally in a capital case, the state has all the money. The defense has to go beg for things that if your client had money, you could buy, and you don't usually get it. This judge said, I want there to be no question that this gentleman got a fair trial. And so he allowed us to have investigators, mitigating experts, expert witnesses, things of that nature. And so we were able to fully protect his rights. And even though he pled guilty to the jury, in other words, there was never any question about his guilt. He got up and said, I did this thing.
Right.
We litigated the actual trial for, I think, 3 or 3.5 weeks. Jury selection took 2.5 months. We litigated that, and we were able to convince, I believe, 1, maybe 2 jurors that he should not get the death penalty. And what the law says is that if all 12 cannot agree to the death penalty, then he gets life without parole. And that is what happened. He had already received 2 life without parole in Missouri, so he was never getting out of prison. That was never the question. And people have asked me before, how do you do that? How do you defend somebody? I mean, you pled him guilty. You know what he did. Wow. And I said, those are, they may not be easy effort-wise, but emotionally, or as far as conceptually what you're doing and the pressure on it, they're easier, because if you do your best to protect the system, then you'll have done your job. The hardest cases in the world is when there's a question or you're convinced that your client is truly innocent. And not only are you protecting the system, but you feel responsible for what happens to his life. And that's when it's difficult. And I think, again, as we kind of talked about with people, what they don't do and don't know about judges, people kind of get divided into two camps. There's people that have either themselves, a loved one, or a friend, or somebody they know has been involved in the criminal justice system, and those that haven't. And those that have firmly understand why there are defense lawyers and why there are rules that protect you from the government, because they realize how powerful the government is. Kennedy, if the government wants to put you in jail bad enough, there is a really good chance you're going to go to jail. Your guilt or innocence is not really a consideration. Luckily, most prosecutors do not operate under that theory. I mean, they may not always operate under the proper theory, that I think in that particular case, but most of the time they are trying to get at what they believe justice is. But if they just want to put you in jail, it is not hard to do. And people should be very jealous of that fragile amount of freedom that they have. You hear a lot of people rail against crime, and I understand that. No one likes crime. No one wants to be a victim. But you have to tolerate a little bit of people not suffering ramifications to keep from it being a system where people that aren't guilty suffer ramifications. Generally, when I talk to juries, when I'm picking juries, and you go over the concept of how do you feel about the saying that it is better to let 10 guilty men go free than to imprison one innocent man, most of the time people go, I believe that. It is scary sometimes when you hear people say, I think that's dumb. If we get it right most of the time, that's okay. Well, that's okay unless it's you. And then no one ever feels that way then. And it gets trivialized. It gets beat into a buzzword to be, crime wave, crime problem, things of that nature. It is so much more complicated than that. The enforcement of law is a very complicated thing, and you have to hold people responsible for their actions. But you have to do it in such a way that it means something so that other people learn from that. If you just arbitrarily put people in jail, all that engenders is fear and disrespect of the system. But if they believe that if they do something wrong, they will get caught and they will be punished, then you have some hope that many people will not commit crimes.
Very true. Very true.